There is a very real art and science to alchemy. Everything is all about getting into the most purified essence of oneself, which is removing the dross. The more you go through each stage of alchemy, you'd see something become more refined. The first stage is calcification. It's a blackening stage. It's what I would consider the dark night of the soul. Once it gets less cathartic, now it starts becoming divine. Alchemy's on all scales. We're going through massive polarization. What's happening at a macrocosmic level, or what's happening at the collective consciousness level, is now creating so much dissonance that there's a lack of resonance. Gnosis is even just strictly salvation, spiritual knowledge that is secret. If you really break that down, that's alchemy. Anything that makes us meet ourselves at a very deep level would be purification. Fire plays a very strong role at every layer of reality and in every layer of alchemy. Carl Jung was an alchemist. He rebooted the system. There is no better setting to talk about false crystallization than all of the work that we just went over. Gnosis is more than one thing, in my personal opinion. And sometimes I even lose touch with really the doorway that brought me into specific knowledge, because once I'm through that doorway, I have the gnosis at that point of that thing or with that thing. So that's why I would define it as union. How gnosis is generally defined is by spiritual knowledge. And then some parts of gnosis is even just strictly salvation, spiritual knowledge that is secret. And then if you really break that down, that's alchemy. Alchemy would be the science or the art behind that spiritual knowledge that is secret and salvation based. So there's a lot of different prisms that we can run gnosis through. But I would say it in this context as I developed true union with what alchemy was. And from there, the tricycle wheels are off. Whatever you're taught is just simply the doorway, the gateway for it. So I started seeing alchemy with everything. Like if you I know this might make alchemist heads like completely like fall off, but I see alchemy as like if you close a door or not. Like the energy in the space of a room specifically. So I see everything. And, it's not just me saying that also, like alchemists, specifically ones that have to do with elixirs, spagyrics, anything that is infusing the alchemical knowledge and wisdom into some sort of craft, into some sort of herbal tincture or medicinal unit. They use the stars. They can't make specific remedies or even specific types of invoctions all year long. They're going based off of strictly the vibes and strictly the seasons, down to even the minutia of astrology, into gateways, all these different things that are being infused into something. So they're harnessing the powers of the above, but not just in even a way where there's no structure to it. So that's my basis coming back to like if you close a door or not, specifically everything I see through the lens of alchemy. Chemistry. Where did chemistry come from? Chemistry came from alchemy. Chemistry specifically, it's not even something that has to do with Eros necessarily. Chemistry is more than one person's energy combined. What would that be? That's specifically what we know through psychology as like, okay, let's see their chemistry together. That's alchemy. You're putting forces together in a specific way that creates a specific, unique, and special outcome. So it's through basically my own union with the concept of alchemy that kept unfolding and kept unfolding deeper dimensions of it.
Because in traditional alchemy, you've got the stages. Like, you probably correct me if I'm wrong, but there's the negredo, albedo. You've got something citrine. I'm probably going to get that wrong, and then there's a
Yeah.
ruby. There's a ruby
And
phase. Yeah.
yeah. And then albino. So that would be the four classical stages. And that
Mm.
one is still a very strong way of perceiving the great work. I would even say that that was rival to the seven stages. And so Jung even used that format of the four. I do see it more through the lens of 7, but sometimes it's even used in 12. There's 12 stages. And so the one that's the most classical system would be what I said, which was 7. But even from there, I've never actually seen an alchemist kind of like show 8 or 9, but I have heard that, people used any amount to cut that up. And it really kind of makes sense that way if you think about it, because once you master something, you break away from the structure that you needed to get there. And you needed that structure at a certain point to help you understand and to build up your awareness and knowledge about it. But then once you're there, now true masterfulship is something that can do it inside out, blindfolded, backwards. And so being able to look at it through the prism of 9 or the prism of 8 isn't unheard of. But the classical 7, I really like. I resonate with that strongly.
Yeah, it's really interesting because even in the Vedic culture, like different actually old manuscripts, everyone's sort of bought into this idea of 7 chakras at the moment. But there are different manuscripts that say some say we have 9, some say we have 13, and it's like these are just energetic centers. Like I'm sure generally, like you said, there's an opportunity for us to come to the awareness that we have 7. But then once you've sort of worked with them, I'm sure you'll end up finding probably have an energetic center where you didn't even realize that you had one, and you can probably break it down to whichever model you want. The 7 different stages, can you elaborate on them for us and bring us to them?
Yeah. So the first stage is calcification, and that would be what you were considering Negredo. It's a blackening stage. It's what I would consider, if we're looking at this spiritual transformation part of alchemy, this would be the stage that I would personally define as the dark night of the soul. So I equate it with fire. Fire has more than one purpose in esoterica, but this is one of its strongest purposes, I would say. It is through the fire of the spiritual transformation, that initial phoenix. And I know that we look at the phoenix rising from its own ashes as being almost the end product, but in alchemy, it's just the beginning. And so this would be that initial way of breaking through and penetrating the ego. It would be through fire. And, we could look at it through other elements, which each one does have its own stage exemplified through an element, but I like how it starts with fire, because if you think about it, fire is really harsh, right? So it's kind of like it's in perfect proportion to the ego at that stage. It would need to be something harsher. And then the more you go through each stage of alchemy, you'd see something become more refined. It doesn't always necessarily need to be fire, because the ego is not in proportion or resonance with that. So it starts off in calcification. And then after that, it goes into the water stage. This is like dissolution. And so it is being purified now through the emotional body, through the subconscious lens. And so from there, it goes into separation. Separation would be what I would consider the air element. And this is where it's really starting the first time to get the intellect involved. Because I would consider that when it's in calcification, there things are too shaken and shocked to really be able to start having the distance necessary to start intelligently reflecting. So
Discernment.
you're in it. Yeah, you're in it. And then the emotional body in the second stage, just as much. But now we're getting almost brought into the emotional body. That's how I would equate it, because I don't see the world, myself included, I don't see that process as a gentle one. It's almost like things needing to get to a certain point of existential questioning, for you to even start really bending a knee, so to speak, to the emotional body, to the feelings, to that aspect of ourselves. Before then, usually there's a lot invested in, not maybe armoring up, it could be that, but invested in having the intelligence or the intellect really kind of run the show. And so in this stage now, you're going deeply submerged, whether you like it or not, into the subconscious and the emotional content there. So I would consider the first two stages really ones of divine intervention, ones that are feel at least like they are done to you. And then the separation stage with the element of air is once again, as I was saying, one where now we start actually dissecting things. We start analyzing falsehood from truthhood, who we are, redefining things like, oh, I was like this. I don't really resonate with that anymore. Or, oh, I see this distortion, or I see this block, or I see where I was presenting myself. We start shifting and sifting through things at the mental level at that point before it goes into conjunction. So, conjunction is the earth element. And this is where we go, okay, I did some spiritual transformation. Now let's see the new self. So, it's kind of what I would consider the rough draft of the final work. So, it's almost if you were to do a rough draft of a paper and you're treating it as though it's the final product. So you're putting all the effort, all the energy, all the transformation into it as though if absolutely you weren't going to revise it, this was the complete process. And of course, because it's alchemy, you take that and then in the next set, the next stage, you putrefy it. You make it banana juice. You go, wow, this was a great draft. I got an idea. Let's ferment it. So the next process is a death process. It takes that draft of you going, oh, I'm in union, because that's what conjunction means. Okay, so let me step back a little bit. How alchemists would perceive all of this is that conjunction is the first point of union between spirit and matter, between sulfur and mercury, between our masculine and feminine hemispheres, or what we could see as like the sun and the moon. I should say that first before I tell you my bit about it. So then once it gets to the next step, now we're in fermentation. And once again, fermentation is like, wow, this is a great union you made, but it'd be better if we made it rot. So it just goes through a rotting process to really make sure that it's extracting from it that fermentation, like kombucha. It will be better if it just gets a little kombucha. And then from there, it goes into distillation. And this is now creating from that extract vapors. So remember how I said in the beginning how at first it starts off as very violent, intense, harsh with fire. And you start seeing how it's going more and more through a process until we get to distillation. And in distillation, it's more refined. Now the process is still in motion. All of these are about a dynamic exchange. So they're dynamic, and you could look at it almost like the movement can be cathartic in the beginning, but then once it gets less cathartic, now it starts becoming a lot more divine. And so it's unraveling through that motion, through that dynamism. And so at this point, it's going through that dynamism, but it's going through that dynamism in now a vapor form. And how I would equate this so that it makes sense to somebody who's watching and who wants to really understand is through a spiritual lens of how do I take this and apply it to spiritual transformation. It would be more so where we're cut open enough at this point to start connecting with the abstract, to start connecting with the subtle, because this stage in itself, I would say, is the most subtle. You're in vapor form. You're dealing now with alchemists do this, whether it's spagyrics, whether it's alchemy, whatever it is that has to do with the art of alchemia. You're actually waiting for the vapors to come back into your distillation instruments so that you can start working with that. So remember that banana juice? That banana juice actually turned into these very subtle vapors. So that's why I say alchemy is also the art of reducing. because how much of yourself is already there? And it's really just the layers between you and that core self, the layers between you and that core divinity that need dissolving. So, because of that, the refinement process at distillation is one that we could look at through the spiritual lens of like our psychic centers now coming online and being activated from all of that great work. And then it gets to coagulation. And coagulation would be when we finally turn in the rough draft, when we go, okay, it's not a rough draft anymore. This is true union. This is true union between all of our parts and elements. So at coagulation, it's very important that we equate that, or that we know that stage through the lens of quintessence. The quintessence would be the fifth element. Before the quintessence, what we're doing is we're working and moving and purifying and evolving the four elements. All of it's quintessence, by the way, but I'm just giving us a structure to see things through. So it's really when we get to the coagulation stage, which I don't know if people are familiar with that term. In esoterica, it always is equated with the quintessence or with the complete union. We could look at that also if we're looking at this through a Jungian lens, Jungian psychology. We could look at this as the self, beyond the complexes, but the self, the true self, the one that has no end. So once we get to that self, it's through this unification process. And this unification process brings about what I would consider the quintessence, or what alchemy considers the quintessence, which would be spiritual man or stellar man. And then, of course, after that, you start over. You start over and you start over.
Inspired Soul, just wanted to take a quick sec out to thank all of you that are subscribed to the channel. Thank you so much for your incredible love and support for everything that is birthed and created here, championing love, positivity, wisdom around the world. To all of you that are yet to subscribe, please do take a moment. It just takes a quick sec. As I'm saying the word subscribe, the button below is lighting up in the colors of the Inspired Evolution. Please hit subscribe, hit that bell notification icon. 2 episodes like this come out every week, championing love, positivity, wisdom all around the world. This entire channel is powered and empowered by your love and your subscription to the channel. Thank you so much for your incredible support. Back to the episode. Wow. Thank you so much for stepping us through that entire journey. And it's really interesting. There's so many questions along that entire journey that I could ask you about. One of the places to start, I guess, is even us starting with the fire. The element of fire is quite an interesting, well, we could probably do a whole podcast on it and still not be done with discussing the element of fire. But even just, there's a whole Indian tradition to pray to the Agni Hotri, like to see the fire as an element, as a portal almost, to be able to communicate through the veil, right? Because you've got fire and there's potentially as you said, there's the opportunity to transmute stuff, and you likened it to the dark night of the soul. Like it's equal parts crisis, equal parts opportunity. And so, like, when in these Indian cultures, you're praying, but you're feeding rice to the fire with all your intentions programmed into it, right? Of like what you would like, and sometimes it's helping you mourn and let go of loss. And sometimes it's helping you draw in what you want to draw in. But it was always very interesting to sort of think about how they're revering the fire, and maybe, almost as like a gateway to communicate to on the other side. The two is left open and blank. I don't know. But do you know what I mean? There was always that sort of interesting relationship with just how transformative fire can be as a starting place.
Oh, absolutely. So I've done a video on water, and I was really excited about that video when it came out, because I felt like I got the breath and space to do it correctly. And if I do another one on water, it won't be because something in that one wasn't complete. But I haven't done one on fire yet. And the reason I haven't is because I have built it up too much. Sometimes I do this with a topic. There's a few topics that overwhelm me because they're just a topic that I think, oh my, you need to, and I could, if I just like give half an hour of structure to do it, but it's not about that. I trust the vibes. So I trust that, okay, maybe 95% about that thing for the video, but maybe you are being overwhelmed by that because there's 5% that you don't know you're going to learn about it that you want in there. Or maybe I'm just thinking too much about it.
Yeah, it's really interesting watching yourself describe all these different processes that we go through. And well, the alchemical process of, because I think most people can visualize a cauldron and them going through like a chemical set where they're playing with the alchemy. But then I think it's less common for us to look at, oh, actually, our life is a bit of a cauldron at times, and and there's all this stuff going on, and it's actually touchwood happening to us. Or I don't want to say as an experiment, but as an experience, yeah, like for sure, right? It's definitely happening to us. These different stages that we're going through. Can you share more about that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the first thing I feel called to mention is how in Vedic alchemy, cauldron is the stage of the secret secretions where the enteric nervous system, which later on got turned into, it got Christianized into the manger, but the solar plexus region was originally in Vedic alchemy called the cauldron. And that's where that thing I was calling earlier, like dynamism, is going on to the spiritual essence, that spiritualized ether, or what gets called Amrita. Um, yeah, the nectar that is the seed for the spiritual link through alchemy. So, as you may know, through the sacred secretion, the spiritual link for spiritualizing matter and materializing spirit. That whole link is created through physical alchemy. It's replicated on all layers of reality. So sometimes I have people ask me, like, is alchemy about this or is alchemy about that? And of course, my answer is it's on all scales. So when I'm talking about the physical, physiological alchemy, it's done, it all takes place, like the transformation of that seed through that link is done through the cauldron of the solar plexus region. So that's the first thing I feel called to say about that. It's that the way that the fire is seen, so in its base form as it being a cauldron, it really shows you. And then even from there, fire is known as spirit. So fire plays a very strong role at every layer of reality and in every layer of alchemy, but it just changes the way that it is manifested as. So fire in its most spiritual form is way more refined. I mean, fire can even be looked at as the highest form of alchemy, ether. But then at the lowest scale, it's that transformation, it's that dynamism that takes place in the cauldron. So the cauldron of the solar plexus, the cauldron of life, it really is one of those things where it's not just a platitude. The metaphor is the actual living experience of it, and which chicken or egg, which one is inspired by the other at that point because it's just in motion.
I'm hearing also somewhere echoing in the background of this conversation is the seven hermetic laws somewhere, and there's like the correspondence as above so below. I can sort of hear that echoing in the conversation. And as you were describing the sacred secretion and Amrita, and I was like, I know my name leaves a lot to live up to. It's intense carrying the awareness of, yeah, Indian names are actually, yeah, super deep and not to be underestimated, but also quite a burden to carry in some ways, as a label for the self. Yeah, interesting also that I couldn't help but notice that the way you're approaching alchemy as well is that everything is alchemy. It also brings into the frame that no ingredients are wasted. If we're still just sticking with the fire thing for just a moment, like all of it is a necessary ingredient for the transformation to get to where it needs to go. And that's not just like, well, we'll move into the water and the air in just a moment, but that's not just the like the thought components. It's not just the physical happenings and actions, but the emotional contents. Like is that yeah, like that is that everything? Like, everything is necessary for the trend, like, nothing's wasted? Is that your worldview? Can you see what I'm pointing to there and help clarify?
Oh, absolutely. Nothing is wasted, but at the same time, I would say that there's a very savage quality to alchemy. And either people don't know this, so they don't say it, or it's just not something that is kind of like taught. But there's a concept called dross, and dross is just the offshoot. It's what it is the it everything goes into alchemy if you want to look at it through the spiritual lens of alchemy. So we look at it through the context of life. The reason I'm saying that is because there is a very real art and science to alchemy of the body, mind, spirit that leads at an esoteric level even to purification, and one could even say or muse immortality of that body, mind, spirit. So if we're going to just take it out of that context of alchemy, that would, I'd say, be like the deepest part of it. And if we're just looking at it first through the level of spiritual transformation for our own consciousness, at this level of alchemy, everything goes into it, right? Like that would be a way that if we want to engage with this archetype of being the alchemist, that we say nothing is wasted. Nothing is wasted. All trials, all challenges, all everything gets put into the great work, becomes that final product of art in some way, no matter how far removed it looks. It becomes, the heightened form of that. And so there's that. And then there's also this really savage concept called dross. And that would kind of be the stuff that gets the things that are not pure. So everything is all about at that point getting into the most purified essence of oneself, which is removing the dross. Just everything else becomes dross at that point that needs to be cleared away and falls out. It falls out from the process itself. So it is everything that we could look at is false or that is distorted or blocked within us, even something that is detrimental. Everything that is not like the true whole self or the true whole enlightened or unified being. So in alchemy, what we could look at is that there's the seeds. There's the seeds of gold in everything. And sometimes, even in an academic setting, but definitely in a historical setting, alchemy is looked at as exposing nature to unravel those seeds upon themselves, meaning that putting them in front of natural processes so that those latent seeds can be broken open and exposed into gold. So what would be broken open and left out of the work, like it was no longer needed, it was removed from the work, it was looked at as dross. We could take this even further and look at dross, Kabbalah. There's a lot of alchemical or spiritual systems and mysticism that look at evil as the dross of creation. It's like, look, this didn't mean to happen. It's not that creation said, hey, let's make evil. It's just that for a creative process also comes this other byproduct. And this byproduct is this celestial or this existential dross. It's like, which is interesting because back to how alchemy is about creation, alchemy is a creative process. If there's light, then you could look at the dross as being like an inherent offshoot, an inherent byproduct would be darkness. And so, to answer your question, everything is used. And at the same time, not everything is always needed. The more that you progress along the way, dross gets revealed, it gets purified, it gets removed. And that does not mean that we remove ourselves from whatever that is. This isn't something that we should consciously be doing. As a matter of fact, we should be doing the opposite. We should be embracing, accepting, becoming aware of, sitting with, integrating it all. And as that happens, what will naturally happen is the dross will fall away from that. So it's not that, oh, we get rid of everything dark so that there's only light. Instead, that final artwork in that gallery is the beauty of the process that became it.
Hi there, guys. I wanted to take a quick moment just to introduce you to my one-to-one coaching. It's something that I deeply love doing. As you can tell, conscious conversation is such a massive part of my life. And having one-to-one, deep, meaningful conversations with people where I get to show up as your brother or as the coach or as your mentor has been such a gift for me personally, and a gift for lots of the people that I have supported on the journey of living a more spiritually empowered, spiritually powered, spiritually aligned life. You don't have to take my word for it. Here's some examples of people all around the world that have experienced profound transformations through this coaching experience.
Amrit is a fantastic coach.
In a few sessions, he got to a depth that I'd only experienced before working with certain medicines. And
he's gone through a lot of the struggles that you're probably facing, and Amrit's been a really strong, supportive figure in my journey.
In control of myself.
I'm kinder to myself.
I actually have that vision and a purpose.
I do feel like I'm a better version of myself already.
Amazing energy.
He was easy to talk to, which made me easy to trust him.
Working with Amrit at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and really I was bouncing out of bed.
Whenever I get off the calls with Amrit, best money we've ever spent.
I would not recommend him because I don't want everyone to know about him, and then I won't be able to book him. If he gets too busy, I won't get my turn.
I would say absolutely.
There's no way you can work with Amrit for a period of time without being transformed.
So if you're considering him as a coach, do not hesitate, because you won't be disappointed.
Alrighty, so hopefully that's inspiring your evolution onwards and upwards. And if you are so inspired to evolve, you can book in a one-to-one call with me directly at www.amrit.coach/life. And guys, if I can say so myself, I do think this is something quite special. Most people that I see building things online don't really work with people this deeply, this intimately, one-on-one as things start to grow, just because it is so time intensive. And yet I'm so deeply passionate about the transformation that comes from one-to-one coaching that just isn't available anywhere else. It would be my absolute honor and a pleasure to support your spiritual awakening, your spiritual path, your spiritual unfoldment. It is my life's work. I look forward to seeing you in the call. Back to today's podcast. Thank you so much for such a beautiful response. And I think, just to take off where you've just left off, is I think it's very difficult for someone that hasn't had the experience of simply awareness dissolving something, because we feel like there's this necessary to do, like, in order to dissolve something, I must do something. But for those that have actually had the experience, touch wood, fortunately, and an invitation to everyone is, yeah, like, awareness has this ability to just hold space for something, and naturally it starts to shift in the light of awareness as well, which is quite profound, because oftentimes when we're so material in the world, we feel like we need to do something in order to change something, but awareness doesn't feel like a doing as much. It feels like a sitting and observing, but actually it has such an incredible power of its own to shift. There's a question in here. Help me frame it if you can. um, we've got alchemy, and there's like a whole transformation, like it's speaking as an ode to transformation, and we're obviously discussing a lot of duality underneath the banner of oneness and spirituality. I guess the question started with you've got dross, and then you've got potentially what's the useful element of it. Yeah, but then within unity consciousness and everything kind of being whole, there's this, I guess we're back to a spiritual concept where we're all playing in a unified field, but then we're back to duality. And I'm trying to find the place of duality and alchemy. Are they basically interchangeable, duality and alchemy? Or where does the container of alchemy fit in and around the relationship with duality? Is that a super existential question, or did you get the nature of my question?
Oh no, I get it completely.
Epic.
Alchemy is
Thank
when
you.
you're doing duality right. I can say it another way, but
There we go.
it's alchemy when you're doing duality right. When it's not doing duality right, then it's called de-evolving.
So alchemy is evolution in that way then?
Yeah. Yeah, alchemy is like the perfect example is like how the magician. So the magician in the tarot is the alchemist. You could even just swap out magician with alchemist. And so the magician has an infinity symbol over his head, and he has his hands positioned as above, so below. So one could look at the pointed upward hand and the pointed downward hand as being mastering spirit and matter, but also in this context, we can be creative and say mastering duality. And then again, because if there's one thing I think doesn't get said about alchemy, but if you really have union with it, you can develop the agency to just say it's that alchemy just does everything like they have a compulsive disorder for purification. So if it's up and down, then imagine that infinity is also saying like left and right, da 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 da, like covering all of its bases. so so it means within, without, above, below, like they're all being covered somehow, some way. And so alchemy would be when you're doing paradox right, when you're integrating duality. And so I would really say, and a lot of times people ask me, like, what book did you know about that magician through? This is just gnosis. So when it comes to the magician, one of the things that's most known about the magician is manifesting spirit through matter. That's spiritual conduit. But when I'm talking now about like mastering paradox, that's just my gnosis. There's not actually a footnote for that. So when we're talking about duality, specifically having to do with alchemy, and then how to really frame this, it'd be really helpful to understand that when we're looking at duality, what we're looking at is something that has not been rectified. And the alchemist is or the magician is the perfect archetype that can rectify it. And how it would be rectified is through paradox. It would be able to understand duality, and when you understand duality, you're able to unify it in some way that would appear at first glance as being contradictory, but actually, if you penetrate that deeper, it would reveal that there is some sort of harmony that was created, so that you can't actually call it duality anymore, which is why I've promoted it to paradox.
I feel like we haven't explicitly said it, but this is quickly turning into an energy healing masterclass. Is this because of that alchemy, because of the nature of duality, then is this where also, well, your work as an energy healer sort of lives as well?
Yeah. It's funny because a lot of my work has to do with actually being able to tune in to someone, and while I'm hearing their things, unravel some missing piece that it was almost like, how is that going to ever get triggered and stuff. So I would say that I, like everything goes into the alchemy, I go into the energy work. I naturally go into the energy work, and I look at things very much through a lens of what is the best tool to use in this, for this exact specific scenario. Meaning that if it has to be humor, because humor would be like water in that scenario and be able to get to a deeper layer that it wouldn't be able to normally, then humor and stuff. So the energy work, definitely, like I have a modality I do, I utilize that modality. But I would say just even the activations that somebody's receiving by speaking with me. And I say activations in a way where I am somebody who always sought activations. So I don't consider it egotistical at all if someone's going to someone for an activation, because everything activates. Everything is medicine. Every single person has a specific type of medicine, whether they're aware of it or not. And so I view other people as being able to provide that. And when they do provide it, that I consider that an activation. So I receive activations from other people. I've gone places specifically to receive activations from people. And so when I say that people are receiving activations from me, that's not specifically what I think someone would like say. I don't think they would say like, "Oh, I'm paying to get an activate," but that's actually the energy exchange that's taking place. That's like the subconscious thing that's going on.
Just a little sidebar footnote there. One of my favorite things about your YouTube channel is actually when you're sharing, you're always very aware of what's coming through and what you want to share, but then also you're very aware of like how it may be picked up and how it's not incongruence to what's being shared. And you just did that then again. I just wanted to point that out because that's one of my favorite things about your channel. It just, yeah, it's very clean, the transmission touch wood. Thank you for clarifying that. Really appreciate it. Not just in this podcast, but also on all your videos. Super dope how you navigate that.
Oh,
Hey,
thank you. It's
yeah.
because when I'm tuning in to who I'm speaking to, they're creating like my audience is creating a collective asking. And so I have some ability, not all, but I have some ability to intuit, even though it's not, the video hasn't come out yet. I'm still having some agency, not all agency, but some to intuit. And that's why I start already dismantling somebody's like blocks to receiving something in advance. It's because I'm intuiting that.
Awesome. Hey, you were talking about, I know Jungian philosophy also has a massive influence in your work as well. And you mentioned before, like the alchemy lives within, the alchemist versus the magician being kind of like a trade one for one, in terms of nomenclature there, just the title. Jung has 12 different archetypes. Are there different bodies of work underneath each archetype that basically are a path to ascension or enlightenment? Or do you feel like certain ones have a path forward, certain ones don't? Like, yeah, just curious about that.
That's a great question. So there's definitely some that I guess we could look at as being stronger energies for specifically ascension. But then also I would see it, and I forget Jung's 12, but I remember when I studied those, I remember I really had a strong affinity with the sage, right? But then
Yeah.
there's other ones that I remember that I thought were cool, but now that I would say I have a more mature perspective about it, I really feel like we can deepen into any of those archetypes and evolve through that pathway. And this is something that isn't asked, but I think just would help your audience in general. How you can tell someone who comes more from spiritual maturity isn't because it's a free for all. I would consider free for all type energy being more equated with like very juvenile energy, in fact. But there's this exalted form, just like duality gets unified into paradox. There's this exalted form. And in this exalted form, you can really just see the value in everything and in every archetype or in every path or in every road. And because of that, you allow things to play out because you see that the higher self is creating a really fascinating story arc that you might not fully be able to see, but that you understand has and serves a much larger purpose. Rounding that back to the archetypes, I truly believe that each archetype, if we go deeply into it, will unravel into some sort of divine transformation.
You inspired soul, quick sec, wanted to find out what is your biggest takeaway from today's episode. For me personally, it was the dark night of the soul and the fire element, and then the pressure that comes from the water element when we're trying to transform and learn our lessons, and the separation being the air element and the earth kind of integrating that, and then, just the last little remnants of us integrating the shift completely, being that last element, like the whole journey of the alchemical process of transformation on a spiritual, personal development level. My goodness, that was profound, just having that format in my mind. What are your biggest takeaways? I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. And also, she's likely to come back on in the future. So if you've got any burning questions you'd love to ask Sarah, leave them in the comments below. I'd love to gather them together, and it would be my honor to ask them on your behalf. So feel free to leave those questions below, and if I can, I will ask her in the next episode. So leave me those comments and questions below. I'd love to hear from you. And with that, back to Sarah and today's deep dive on alchemy. just for context, I've got my notes. So the 12 different archetypes we've got the caregiver, the innocent, the magician, the lover, the jester, the ruler, the hero, the explorer, the sage, the creator, the everyman, the outlaw, and it's really interesting to sort of just imagine what each of their different ascension paths would feel like. That was totally a random question on my behalf, but it popped into the field. Interestingly, coming
Oh,
back, I think
would you be able to say the first one again?
the
First
caregiver,
Okay, the caregiver. Now, could you say the last one again?
the outlaw.
Okay, so those two are the ones that stood out the strongest to me as ones that would be like, how would those lead? But yet, if you really sit into it, like it would totally unravel into, an ascension path. Like, okay, the caregiver. The caregiver has energy. Now look, I'll let you know first before I even go into this. My personal um my personal profile around the caregiver. I would say, nuh-uh. You've got a bunch of different types of complexes, of neurosis, like girl, you need to heal that. Okay? So I'm just letting you know that's where I'm coming from that. But now let's look at it from the completely opposite end of that perception. Caregiver would be like such sacrificial energy. And sacrificial energy is a very complex topic, one that I have written down to do at some point because it's so nuanced. And so if we take that and look at it through like a highly refined and nuanced lens, the caregiver is a very maternal, divine energy of growth and nurture through a process that is ultimately of sacrifice. And
I
then
feel like there's a
outlaw,
lot of devotion in there as well.
yeah, no, totally. And then the outlaw would be one where you get to truly, truly see, not rock bottom, I would call it. You could look at it as rock bottom, but the outlaw could be one where you're really seeing the catapult be pulled back all the way before it goes into its opposite mode through the story arc of like that one quote that I love from Oscar Wilde, every sinner was a saint and every saint had a past, something like that. Yeah.
So interesting to feel into that. So almost thank you for clarifying. And I think interestingly, maybe I can pull us back from these 12 different archetypes because they also like symbolize, well, at least to Jung, a purified form of energy. Is maybe I'm drawing parallels at putting words in Jung's mouth, and I should probably relax on that a little bit. um, but coming back into, we were stepping through. We discussed around fire, moving into water and purification. Like I think there's a real interesting space to talk about how to purify. Is probably a really useful. What does that look like in the day to day for an individual when it comes to? And are we sort of purifying within a container, within constraints, towards some sort of guided outcome? And that's where potentially I can draw the bridge from the different archetypes to kind of be like, oh yeah, this is cultivating more of like the hero's journey within me, and I can see how I'm going through something, but I'm being purified because of the journey that I'm going on.
So I love the quality of water, and water in and of itself is such a beautifully rich and in-depth topic. But the reason why baptisms by water was so highlighted, and that first started through a Mithritic order, Mithra, but it carried on far beyond that, and it's not hard to see why the water element, there is such a spiritual almost atonement linked with it. It's because water contains all. So because water holds all the information within it, it's a universal solvent because everything, so due to the homeopathic law of like purifies like. Just like how alchemy's on all scales. It's it's on all scales. So the way that just how like attracts like, right? In the law of attraction, like purifies like in homeopathy, but you need it at like a very invisible almost dosage. And that creates that resiliency. And so water contains all. So because of that, it's a solvent. It's the most powerful solvent. And so through that purification process of now water, just like fire, take on way more than just one form. And they're going to act differently depending on what stage. And at the highest level, it's, you know, even beyond its spirit. That's what water would be, just like how I said that about fire. But how water takes on for this one stage of emotional subconscious purification, that would deeply be us being immersed. So when you think of water in this case of purification, it's not like we're literally in water, right? We're not like we're not like, oh my God, you know.
Can
like,
feel
I'm so-
like you're in some hot water sometimes, though.
Yeah. So really substitute water for immersed. You are immersed inside something. And so what would be so purifying about immersion? Why would you experience purification through the act of being immersed? Well, I mean, that has its own spectrum. I could answer that by being like, purified under what tone? If you're immersed in something, that could be something where it can't escape you. You're sheerly purified from the fact you cannot be distracted by it. It is at that point, you're purified because you're being disrupted. You're being disrupted from your own neurosis. It's almost like the glue sticking together, the continuity of your consciousness is being interrupted because you're immersed, right? Immersed. And so it's a purification simply because it's detaching the glue of your own neurosis, the glue of your own continuity. So that's on one end of the spectrum. Now, if we want to look at water now through still being purification agent, but it's not one that is you're being dunked in, you know, to release your own continuity. We could look at water also as being the purifying element because you're immersed into the waters of one's own life. Have you ever heard of the term like, oh, they're in deep waters? Even biblical sacred texts speak about deep waters. And when we're talking about deep waters, we're talking about highly humbling challenges in life, things that are making us meet ourselves at a very deep level. And anything that makes us meet ourselves at a very deep level, if we're able to open ourselves up to that, would be purification.
Yeah, wow. So there is almost like a compressive nature to the purification that water holds, or am I just feeling that in this conversation?
Oh no, I could go on. Like like fire and water are two topics where literally I could probably just do an audiobook if you gave me one prompt. I could just go on for 2 hours.
I love it. Guys, if you want that, request it in the comments below. This is she's like, I don't know what I signed up for when I came to this podcast. Now I've got to record 2 11-hour audiobooks as well. And so now moving into like air, you said we start to separate things out a little bit more. So air has this, but you also had qualities of the intellect and also qualities of emotion. Also, if I could sort of click and drag something that I heard of following your work, researching your work, you said at this particular point in time, like there's a massive body of work for individuals, individually and collectively, to go into this dropping out of the mind into heart-based coherence. It's like a whole spiritual path just waiting for them right there. Does that belong in this sort of air element of the process, or am I drawing parallels where they don't exist?
I wouldn't say that you're drawing parallels where they don't exist because due to correspondence, we can't ever get away from as above, so below. Each stage contains within it mind heart coherence. So
Sorry.
picking
Please
up at a
elaborate. Yeah.
subtle, yeah, no, you're picking up at a very subtle level on that. Where it starts becoming like a stage, where it's like, okay, now we're doing mind heart coherence, would be conjunction. It would be the stage after that. And in conjunction, that's, remember, the draft where we're going, all right, you guys, I'm doing it. I'm in mind heart coherence. It's done. And then, that gets fermented, of course, because why wouldn't you ferment that? Until it appears once again in coagulation. In coagulation, you're like, you guys, I'm really doing it this time. I'm mind heart coherence.
So can you tell us a little bit more about the intellect, emotion, the quality of air? What's actually being separated out at this particular point? Is it what you're referring to before as dross? Is that what's getting more clarified at this particular point in time?
Yeah, actually, it's the dross. We're becoming aware of it. Because once again, the first two stages are kind of like viscerally violent. I'm gonna make a book called Viscerally Violent. Like this. Okay, so like they're like viscerally violent. And so by the time you get to separation, that's when we start being able to activate reflection. We get to, and all of them, you can be reflective, but you really need distance. And so with air is when we're starting to activate the intellect and activate it to really help sift through. I would say the best, yeah, well, it's called separation, so I would say sifting or separating is the best part of this stage, or how to highlight it, because the intellect is really moving through things in an intellectual way to say, okay, that is dross. I'm aware of that now. Or how we can once again put this into really practical terms for somebody to understand this spiritual transformation, but apply it to their real life. It would be to where our mind's now aware of behaviors, for instance, and going, wow, I see how I was coming from a really distorted place there. I understand now how I was using that pattern, or I understand now how I was acting in a specific mannerism or behavior that was invoking or was kind of like creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. Something along those lines, something where we're being able to really activate our ability for reflection. So I would link the intellect's highest purpose at this point to not just be active awareness, but also reflection. And it's through reflection that the majority of our path is learned. So I don't want anybody to think that they have to, like Prometheus, which is the archetype of forethought, is something that is almost a myth for a reason. It's something that is like, if we're active, great. But actually, the way that we normally learn, I would say like 90%, is through reflection. And so in separation, I would really contribute the strongest part of growth that takes place in this stage with being the ability for the intellect to not just become aware, but also to really strongly develop reflection.
Profound. I can sort of see a bit of a story arc forming in my mind. Is like we go through the massive dark night of the soul, which is like this all like big calamity crisis opportunity hits us, and then there's a bit of more pressure applied in like the water phase, and then it's like, okay, I'm like crumbling here a little bit, and then there's like, okay, let's refine, let's bring some awareness to it, let's observe. Being an earth baby, I'm Virgo, touch wood, for those that didn't know. Don't hold that against me. And those of you that love me for it, thank you so much, touch wood. So the being an earth sign, the coagulation. Do you want to tell us? Conjunction. Tell us a little bit more about this earth phase of the transformative process.
Yeah, it's where the work starts getting grounded, right? Because all these things are happening at a metaphysical level, even the subconscious level. And so, in conjunction, now we're starting to ground the great work. Now we're starting to ground this prototype of our higher consciousness, or I would say this unified consciousness. So, we're starting to see, because there, as you know, there's a large distance between practice and theory. And, I study physics because a lot of my downloads are about physics. So now I'm just naturally drawn into that area due to a lot of the information that I get is on physics. I'm like- and so one thing that I've seen is that there's a large distance between like mathematical formulas, for instance, and then actually how they play out in physics. And so what I would say is that that is exactly perfectly what alchemists built into this stage, already having that ancient knowledge. It was that, and then of course, by the time it got to Carl Jung, I would say rebooted the system. So he is where I would say he was a very strong bridge. So it's not that the alchemists were talking about these things from ancient times in the way that I'm necessarily describing them, but that the midpoint, I would say, was Carl Jung's ability to bring all of this together and synthesize it. And I think he played a very pivotal and important role, because a lot of times he gets diminished in academia as being, oh, he psychologicalized alchemy. But instead, if you study his work deeper and more, like sincere about your findings, what you'll find is that he wasn't just psychologicalizing alchemy. Sufi alchemists were doing these stages before Carl Jung existed. Instead, what he was doing was putting them into a really substantial but modern context. And so, because of that, the way that we're looking at alchemy through the lens of conjunction, specifically being like the earth element of the work, it has to do mainly through being able to understand the difference between practice and theory. And so what we're doing right now is trying to get used to being in practice and not just in theory.
I think this might be news for some people. Carl Jung was an alchemist.
Yeah. Yeah. Carl Jung was an alchemist. He even had a grandfather who was a Mason. So he was heavily influenced by esoteric science. He wasn't just falling upon alchemy because it was like trendy and then putting everything through a psychological filter. Instead, he actually came from, an esoteric background with the work and was bringing together and adding a lot of important pieces to it to create a complete structure for it.
That's really profound. It's almost like what I'm hearing, because we've used the activation word a couple of times. It's almost like he activated alchemy for the modern zeitgeist, almost in some ways.
Exactly. And I think that he added very important parts to the alchemical work for helping it get to this stage we're in now, which is mind heart coherence. Before, yeah, there was the mental and the emotional aspects to it, but he really was able to highlight the process of the emotional body and how it cannot be separated in an intelligent way from not just waking life, but even from our rational processes. So the shadow was his greatest contribution, because I will say something, and that's whether it's esoterica or just simply if we want to say the past, we were not emotionally intelligent. So if Carl Jung was able to come and bring coherency to the system to make it more digestible, it wasn't now a part of like only an initiation mystery school, but then on top of that, start bringing in the feminine and the ability for, that is how you called this and how he activated it. Well, that's true, because what he activated was the feminine, the feminine part of alchemy. I would even say before that, it alchemy knew about that, but it wasn't like practice and theory again. It wasn't like actually emotionally intelligent in the way that we're now moving into emotional intelligence due to our understanding of the shadow.
It's really interesting because I'm wondering if, and maybe I'm drawing too many parallels in the podcast, but we're talking about conjunction and also just the work of Carl Jung, and maybe that, in the role of alchemy in and of itself, he's played a pretty seminal role at this particular embodiment, probably beyond just the conjunction, but maybe there was a bit of a conjunction there. Really interesting to feel into where just a question that naturally emerges in this particular space is like the individuals like being stuck versus the collective being stuck, like because we're going through like in this particular moment you've mentioned a conjunction where like things start to need to integrate, like the practice versus theory. And I couldn't help but reflect on the fact that, yeah, absolutely, having a map does help you navigate the terrain significantly smoother, right? And so, but we oftentimes, like you probably see this a lot in your energy healing work, like people do get stuck individually on some level. And then I couldn't help but also wonder, I'm asking two questions at once, so I should probably be cognizant of that. But where do you find individuals like generally get stuck in their integration work? But then also, collectively, do you feel like we get stuck sometimes as a collective body? Is that a reasonable question to ask?
Yeah. Yeah. And so when it comes to the collective, it gets a lot more high stakes than even in the individual. Now, even though we're a microcosm of that larger process, what's happening at a macrocosmic level or what's happening at the collective consciousness level is now creating so much dissonance that there's a lack of resonance. And I'm sure you've heard this before, how we're going through massive polarization. It's so extreme. And so even, I've been around the block with this timeline split stuff, and I'm still kind of processing a bit of like hangover when it comes to just the amount of polarization happening. And so I wouldn't call the individual going through that level of polarization that I sense in the collective. What I see now is there being less of a direct correspondence to the collective and more of a person's own energy can get trapped depending on their stage of consciousness. So, really, it has to do with rites of passage or what we could look at as milestones of consciousness. Energy that's trapped will have a specific type of like archetypal challenge. And what I mean by that is like when we go through a rite of passage, we can look at it as like it's archetypal. Even if we don't understand it that way or perceive it that way, milestones and rites of passages are archetypal. That just means there's nothing new under the sun. Whatever we're going through is kind of like a challenge that the collective unconscious, at least, is already aware of and has a motif for. Because that's what I mean by archetypal. I mean that there was an original blueprint that created a specific type of resonance or a motif. And so what I see is energy gets stuck, not necessarily doing with what's going on in the collective or not. There is, of course, always going to be something that we could look at if we wanted to as sharing a connection or overlap. If we look for it, we'll find it. But what I see it mainly doing is the trapped energy in this case would be something that has to do specifically with an archetypal challenge for a person's level of consciousness.
Okay, from here it's really interesting to get into the the next phase, which is all you said, putrefying and rotting, and why not make kombucha? It's like it's really interesting to yeah allow things to. And interestingly, like we've gone from like it's theory to like actually integrating it back into like the physical, like tangible, making a thing. But then also, it's almost like this phase sounds like it's a lot of stress testing what you've actually claimed and integrated into your being, and in some ways Yeah, really, like it's gonna rot, it's gonna putrefy, it's gonna do some fancy stuff. What's this next phase called again? And can you describe it a little bit further?
The fermentation?
Is that what it's
Yeah.
called? Is that what it's called, the fermentation phase?
Okay, so putrefaction is what it's called when we're
Yeah.
talking about the 4 stages of alchemy, the one that you
Right.
had originally started on with Negredo.
Yeah,
Now,
but
when
in
we're
your
talking
7
about it,
stages? Yeah.
yeah, through the 7, it's called fermentation.
Okay, cool.
But I go in and out of the terms. I like putrefy. Sometimes it's easier for my mind to grab that word. So yeah, the putrefaction process is death, rebirth. So it
Mm.
would be considered death, even though all of them once again contain the seeds
Breaking down
of
to
each
break
other.
through. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So this would be once the theory and practice have had a go at each other in conjunction. Now it's going through that death process. You know what? We could even say that the death process is because it got grounded in conjunction and it went, oh, wow, I was in theory, not practice. And so then you go through a rebirth. So putrefaction is when or fermentation is when you really go through that rotting, but it's a rotting the way that the fertilizer from that self becomes once again now the ripe soil. So we can look even at fermentation as being almost like we, okay, how many times do we become conscious of something? To me, okay, we could look at consciousness from so many different angles, but how I kind of can wrap up a strong paradigm for the consciousness journey is it all leads back to health. It always has something. There's no real way to kind of unlink health with consciousness to the point where so many people, including myself, be started our journey through the doorway of health. We went like, wait, what's that ingredient? Or wait, what's pharmacies doing? Or this or this or that, like, or we got sick, whatever it is, like, it's very hard to unlink health and consciousness. And so because of that, it's very beautiful that fermentation is a stage where we're literally now caring about the soil, right? Because you get to a stage in consciousness where you you didn't care about the soil, and then all of a sudden you awaken enough to really start going, wait, all that metaphysical stuff's cool, but what about our soil? We start really being able to understand health, so much so that there's no way to really unlink the fact that we're aware and not apply that to our soil. And that's a beautiful way of kind of like thinking of fermentation because that's could be looked at as like the part of our own journey where we're like, well, the soil starts with me. It starts with my gut biome. It starts with my microbiome. Wait, I'm made up of bacteria? Well, then how can I help my bacteria? So, fermentation can also be looked at as when we're purifying and remineralizing our own soil so that it can lead to coagulation.
Yeah, I think it goes all the way, as you were saying, from below, and I couldn't help but go all the way from below, all the way to the above, and I was like, I couldn't help but see soil now as like this kind of Shiv energy, right? It's like it's simultaneously decomposing, it's simultaneously busting open seeds for new life, and it's just like so incredible the energy of transformation that's there. So, is the next stage rot, or do we go straight into dissolution, or is rot live within putrefaction?
Yeah, so all of those are a part of fermentation. The next stage would
Perfect.
be distillation. So in distillation,
Describe
it could be
dissolution,
looked at
because yeah, that's is it distillation or dissolution?
distillation.
Ah, cool. Tell
So
me more. Oh,
dissolution
so
is the second
it's
stage.
almost like another purifying almost. Is that right?
That's why alchemy is the art of purification. Because it's not just one time, it's not just two times, it's every way, every win. So in distillation now, it's vapor form. It is taking that soil and going, okay, what is the fermented juices of this work we have? And we're working with that now. And so that really just goes more to talk very quickly about how alchemy is dealing with very small quantities. Alchemy is only concerned with very small quantities. it's not about how much of this can we take through the door. In fact, it's the complete opposite. It's going, everything needs to get eliminated until you are the truth, until it's no longer reducible, and that will be what is gold. So that's why it's an act of reducing, but I don't say that in a way where it's against being human. I'm not saying that it needs to, it will reduce human neuroticness. It will it will give the human condition quality of life, because now they're finally free from their own neurosis. I don't want it to be looked at like it's trying to undo the human in you. Instead, it's trying to allow you to fully be present in the human experience with quality of life, because how much of us can just be completely haunted by our own complexes? And so that's once again why I like how Carl Jung came in and kind of revamped everything, because he brought the concept of complexes. So when it comes to distillation now, we're dealing with very refined parts, because we've been so honest with ourselves and we've integrated so much of ourselves that we're not having to deal with the same amount of complex or even emotional brunt, because we've processed so much through these stages until we get here. So now we can start actually activating our psychic centers. So distillation can be seen as when we're able to start connecting with the subtle realm, because us ourselves have activated the subtle realm within us. So I would really say that distillation is a very strong stage for psychic man to come through, or the psychicness to be experienced. And so when we get into coagulation now, the next stage, alchemy has a little bit of a quarrel. And I'm being nice, because alchemy, actually everyone will fight you every stage of the way. So you will be in alchemy fights. You should get gloves. So everything I said, I just had to give the disclaimer that was for me, because at any point someone could come in and say, no, this book said this and you were all wrong. So this is all my gnosis on it. Now, at this stage of coagulation or distillation, it really just depends on who you're talking to. There is a massive fight that goes on between the higher self and the lower self.
Right.
So this is what's even known as Mount Pineal. If you've heard of the references in the Bible about Jacob and Mount Pineal, this is
What's
the
Mount
part in
Pineal?
yeah,
Oh,
it's
sorry,
the pineal
I'm interrupting.
gland.
Sorry.
Oh no, you're fine. No, you're fine. So the pineal gland, this is the part somewhere between distillation and coagulation, just depending on who you talk to. There will be, have you ever seen that like classical depiction of an angel wrestling a being on a mountain?
I think maybe.
And the
Doesn't seem
angels win.
completely outside. Yeah, it doesn't seem completely outside of my zeitgeist. Yeah.
So the angel's winning, and that's because there's a struggle that goes on at this point before union, before enlightenment. And that struggle is between the lower self and the higher self. So I don't want to paint distillation just because we're dealing now with essence, spirit, and vapor as strictly only being where everything's smooth sailings from there. Instead, this is when we can actually start being psychically grappled with rather than egoically grappled with, right? Because you don't ask a child to do what an adult should do. That's inappropriate. So instead, now distillation makes you more mature, makes you more evolved enough to even be fought with at this level, right? Because it's all really a fight. So at this point now, it's like, okay, the divine will reveal itself to you. It is your higher self. Will you choose to merge your will? And that is the process that takes place at coagulation, but kind of like, I'd say like at the end of distillation, I think that's where the process starts. And it's this asking of, will you merge your will with your higher self's will? And if that, is just too much, too tall of an order, that doesn't mean, oh, okay. It just means that whatever awareness of that process got reached there, it's going to cycle again anyways. The one thing that doesn't stop is this process doesn't stop cycling. The only thing that is, I guess, a part of the agency we have over the process is, at what octave will it cycle? You can, have the work done at a very mundane way where you're fighting it the whole time or unaware of it the whole time, and it's still happening. That's why I call this the backdrop to all of our lives, because it's the backdrop to all of our lives. And yeah, there's shamanic, initiations. So I don't want to take away from the fact that there are, like different archetypes and different roles in our life that ask, quite a lot and intense, challenges of us. But also, if you look closely, this is happening in the backdrop of all of our lives. And it's just a matter of, will we consciously participate with this process or not? That's already taking place. Or so the level of quality is what happens here at coagulation. So it's always at this point where we're asking some sort of like merger with our will and our higher self's will. But that doesn't mean that it perfectly takes place. End of story. Instead, it's something that can take place to a certain degree, or whatever happens, and then before it cycles over again. Now, whenever you put something out in stages, you might get a very classical reflex, which is fair. And that would be, people say things don't happen perfectly in stages. And I would say that things don't happen perfectly in stages, but there's still rites of passage. So this is a good structure that once we're really aware of, we could take the tricycle wheels off. We could take those wheels off and then start communing with it in its own way. And it might not be something where it's like, oh man, I went through a really intense visceral violence before I got into crying. Like, you might cry first, or you might go through a lot of heartbreak and go deeply into your emotional body. You might not have to go through a dark night of a soul to get there. So even though these stages, I feel personally, are complete and very helpful in explaining the spiritual transformation process, they're not going to always be presented in a linear fashion.
Hi there, guys. I wanted to take a quick moment just to introduce you to my one-to-one coaching. It's something that I deeply love doing. As you can tell, conscious conversation is such a massive part of my life. And having one-to-one, deep, meaningful conversations with people where I get to show up as your brother or as the coach or as your mentor has been such a gift for me personally, and a gift for lots of the people that I have supported on the journey of living a more spiritually empowered, spiritually powered, spiritually aligned life. You don't have to take my word for it. Here's some examples of people all around the world that have experienced profound transformations through this coaching experience.
Amrit is a fantastic coach.
In a few sessions, he got to a depth that I'd only experienced before working with certain medicines. And
He's gone through a lot of the struggles that you're probably facing, and Amrit's been a really strong, supportive figure in my journey.
In control of myself.
I'm kinder to myself.
I actually have that vision and a purpose.
I do feel like I'm a better version of myself already.
Amazing energy.
He was easy to talk to, which made me easy to trust him.
Working with Amrit at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and really I was bouncing out of bed.
Whenever I get off the calls with Amrit, best money we've ever spent.
I would not recommend him because I don't want everyone to know about him, and then I won't be able to book him. If he gets too busy, I won't get my turn.
I would say absolutely.
There's no way you can work with Amrit for a period of time without being transformed.
So if you're considering him as a coach, do not hesitate, because you won't be disappointed.
Alrighty, so hopefully that's inspiring your evolution onwards and upwards. And if you are so inspired to evolve, you can book in a one-to-one call with me directly at www.amrit.coach/life. And guys, if I can say so myself, I do think this is something quite special. Most people that I see building things online don't really work with people this deeply, this intimately one-on-one as things start to grow, just because it is so time intensive, and yet I'm so deeply passionate about the transformation that comes from one-to-one coaching that just isn't available anywhere else. It would be my absolute honor and a pleasure to support your spiritual awakening, your spiritual path, your spiritual unfoldment. It is my life's work. I look forward to seeing you in the call. Back to today's podcast. Yeah, it's really interesting. In there, I couldn't help but feel what you were doing with distillation and coagulation. Kind of, one of the things I studied is the gene keys, and there's like it's based on the I Ching, and there's this really annoying thing which I absolutely love about the I Ching, right? Like hexagram 63, which is the second to last one, is called upon completion, and then 64, which is the last one, is called before completion. And you're like, wait, no, wait, what? Like your logical mind just completely goes, because you'd think like 63 would be before completion and 64 would be like upon completion. But there's always like this dance to the mystery and this ode that's played out and like the intertwinedness. And I love what you were saying about it's an opportunity for your higher self, and it's never like, yeah, levels also like in my mind sort of feels very distinct. And I often feel life is happening always on a spectrum to some degree, and it feels more less graduated, more granular. But I totally hear what you're saying about rites of passage as well. One of the questions I've got, which is just a trippy dippy question I've always carried, and is around surrender, because it seems like there's you're inviting us to, giving us permission to, at this point, like where it's coming to distillation and coagulation, it's the merger of the higher self and the lower self. It's like, is there parallels to what people say is like, okay, time to surrender now, is that the spiritual path that we're referring to there? And if so, the question that sort of comes in downstream from there for me is, I find it really interesting because surrender is quite an interesting topic, because how do you discern between surrender being completely something super passive? It's like, okay, surrender now, and it's sort of showing up as a spiritual bypass, versus like rubber gloves on, rubber boots on, and it's like, all right, got to try and actively surrender. It's the passive versus active nature of surrender. It feels very, or maybe I'm just overthinking it, but yeah, is this a point where surrender is what's being called to, and then nuances on actually surrendering?
No, I think this is a very important thing you asked. Surrender, I would say the lower qualities for the heart. I can't think at the moment of another way to explain it, so I will use a personal example. In my position, the more visible I grow, the more successful I am, the more abundant I am. I have felt called for a lot more of personal surrender, but it's because of how much space my heart is holding and for how many groups of consciousness my heart is holding it through. So I will surrender a lower part of the ego that wants to post a stupid, funny meme if I feel like the greater good for the greater whole would actually not be inflamed by sharing that egoic throwaway meme. And that's surrender. It's the higher will coming in. And if you have to personally surrender so much, then you're just not ready yet. So it's a different stage. When you're here, it's the next natural stage. It's the one that makes the most sense. So at that point, it's not like, oh my God, the divine is asking me to erase myself. No, it's so the next natural stage that it's something that petty. That's why I had to give a personal example. I really don't know how to give it in another way, because just insert something where you're asking for the greater good of something and for you to over something that is petty and egoic. And I don't mean, I'm not bashing the ego, but when I say the ego, I'm talking about it once again through the lens of Jung, the ego and the self. The self is always going to have a natural, unique perception. So even though I go in and out, I do the infinity symbol with the term ego. Sometimes I'm defending it, depending on the person. If I could tell that they need medicine because they're in resistance to ego, I'll be like, there's nothing wrong with the ego. But then you'll see me on the other end of the paradox. Sometimes if I'm seeing somebody clearly at a highly spiritual level that is still defending the ego, I go, oh, no. I could tell that's ego. That's the ego wanting to hold on to ego. So it really depends on just where a person's at with their own relationship with ego. But when we get to this stage, now we have to define it. And I can't be so minced words. I have to be completely honest to teach this level. And this is surrendering the ego. This is saying at this point that no more can the ego go further, because it will rot, not in a good way. It is no longer positively inclined anymore for its progress, anymore for its evolution, anymore for its growth or maturity. At this point now, it is the next natural stage is to progress or not answer that call. But either way, it's the ego in a detrimental phase, not wanting to grow up, not wanting to grow out of its complex, grow out of its limited behavior. And so at that point, what we're looking at is a refusal to go into unity consciousness, something that is very obvious. Because before that, we start going, no, personal, we have to honor the personal. No, this, we have to honor that. When we get to this stage now, it's the next natural stage. I just want to really highlight that. If you're truly here, not just like saying it, if you're truly here, it is natural. It is the next thing. And so it should be unity consciousness. Or else at that point, it is going to negatively cause some form, even if it's psychic violence, some form of subtle violence to itself and to its environment, because it's not in unity consciousness. So that's why you see the angel wrestling the being, and it's all at a peak. Like, of course, it's a very dramatic scene, and it takes place in the pineal gland because it's how the pineal gland goes into enlightenment.
You mentioned this is the backdrop of our lives in many ways. And I've heard, there's different schools of thought. Some people say we work to 9-year cycles, we work to 7-year cycles. Is some of this alchemical process working to some prescribed length of cycles? I know you said it isn't, it's always happening for everybody in different stages, and it's not super levels, like it's a bit more spectrumy. It's a bit of a gradient. But is there something going on in the back of your head in terms of your awareness, in terms of like, do we every 7 years kind of move through a cycle in life? And could they be pinned somewhat to the alchemical process that we've just described?
Yes. And also how you could look at this is like, look at it at a cellular level. What happens every 7 years to every cell in our body? It has, by the time it's 7 years, we're not even the same musculoskeleton, because bones are the ones that are hardest to replicate. They take the longest. So the bones are the ones that take 7. So in 7 years, we're a completely new cellular body, everything, which is crazy how like scars can replicate when it's like supposed to be like, but anyway, so it's that down to like the cellular level. But then when you apply it at the level that you're talking about, when we're talking about like phases at a larger level, it's still 7. And so there's a few different cycles we can like run things through, like 7's not the only one. But when it comes to specifically what you're talking about, yeah, it's 7.
Amazing. Thank you so much for clarifying that. Question I've got is, we're super in the details, and I'm afraid to ask such a broad brush question because it'll lack so much nuance, but I have to ask. When we get to this later stages, this distillation, this coagulation, you also use the word quintessence. It's a word that I've got just a lot of space in my heart for, even, and it's not even like, spiritually, it's just, I love a good pocket knife, the Swiss Army knife, it's like, it's like the quintessence of like, that is that thing when people are like, oh, that's the Swiss Army knife of, and it's like, yeah, so Swiss Army knife is quintessentially that thing, like it's just nailed what it was meant to be. So in there, just the idea of quintessence, Yeah, what do you think is the quintessence of a human being?
So so quintessence is the fifth element, and the fifth element is love, but it's not just any love; it's love with a capital L. So it would be that ability to go completely. It would equate to the heart center, and it would go completely into the unconditionality of consciousness. So it's very beautiful because I was telling this to someone the other day. I was saying that sometimes the best way for angelic being to perform their work is to not go into ascended master consciousness, because it depends on what they need to do. When you go naturally through an evolution, you will get to what I call ascended master consciousness. And when you're in ascended master consciousness, you see the purpose of everything, you see the value of everything. And it's not like, well, my work here is done, but it's along those lines of an exiting consciousness. You have so much, and it's not coming at all from a feigness. There's nothing vain or feign in it. It's a genuine, you get it. Like, oh, I don't need to intervene. so so what you'll need is actually just enough wounding to be helpful, if that makes sense. And so you will naturally go into ascended master consciousness through fifth element, love with the capital L, heart centered operating. Like you will fully be able to not just live, oh, I did mind heart coherence, right? Like the unity consciousness is so unified that it's spirit, because that's what the quintessence is. Quintessence is spirit. So spirit breaks itself up into these different elements, but they're all spirit, but they're just, aspects of the larger thing. And that larger thing is quintessence. So when you're at that level of quintessence, you're unconditional in your love. Your heart center is fully open. That's how it would correspond.
I'm so glad I asked that question. Thank you for that. And you did an awesome video with collab with After School, and you've talked about timelines before, and I just wanted to quickly get your thoughts on how you think collectively we're going and where we're headed from here. Yeah, is it filled with hope and optimism? We've talked a lot about today in terms of, it's all transformation. There's dross, and it's part of the necessary part of the transformation as well. But yeah, where do you sort of see collectively we're at? Maybe potentially even just with a lens of everything we've discussed today. The different levels. Do you see humanity kind of going through a collective shift at present?
So what I see is actually they're just being choice points. And if we're talking about going through the alchemical process or going through the dross, you could even look at that as kind of like distinct realms, but also just as curriculums. You could just look at one as being the one that makes the most sense, and then the other realm as being the one that just makes the most sense. So even when we're talking about timelines, the really interesting thing to point out is that we're simplifying them by saying like two, right? Because like through mitosis, it starts off that way. But then from there, now you're seeing the multiplicity. So what we're talking about when we're talking about timelines is we're talking about just like large trajectories. So one that's going in a positive upward direction, the other that's going in a catabolic direction. And what I mean by catabolic is that it's one that does not recognize itself in the other. And so naturally, it will eat its own tail. It will catabolize itself. It's a catabolic process. And so with that, now we could look at it from like, okay, well, there's so many different timelines that can be ones that produce an uplifting and empowering, conscious and aware, reality. And then there's so many different timelines that can represent curriculums where we're not consciously choosing, but we're resonating stronger with, fear, limiting beliefs, separation, things that really reflect a core nature of eating your own tail. Because so many times we start really becoming sincere about wanting to learn something. I don't care what it is, whether it's health, whatever it is. So we go deeper into it. And what you'll find is that a conversation will naturally hit some sort of like dead end where you go like, but that doesn't make sense. And that is the thinking of, even if it's high intelligence, it doesn't really matter. If it's not unified with the heart, it doesn't make sense. You'll be like, but why? But why would they do that? But why would we do that? And you'll hit a dead end where it's like, that doesn't make sense. And it's one because it just don't make no sense. And so then you have timelines that where you're taking into consideration a larger awareness. You're taking into consideration your place even in the cosmos. You're just able to expand your awareness. And when you're able to expand your awareness and deeply, purify your consciousness through that alchemical process, that will naturally lead towards a new curriculum. So this is just talking about the thing that makes the most sense for you to next learn, right? Because we're hoping that it's not just theory and practice. We're hoping that your consciousness is engaging in the world in some way where your actions are reflecting that. And so I'd say even we're coming out of an age where we were just maybe only conscious at a mental level. Now, I would say that at least the first wave of ascension is already in like practice. We're already now in, no, how do we bring this unified consciousness into our actions, into our everyday life? How do we like bare bones be able to be that expanded awareness, to be that conscious change in a way where our actions are reflecting our empowerment?
I love that. And I think it's probably worth clarifying. Your first wave of ascension is actually quite high in the in the waves of ascension. I think Dolores Cannon has it the other way around, right?
Yeah, that's a good thing to mention. So so the first wave of ascension to me are people who've gone through the ringer of the negative aspects of our external reality and have now entered into the negative aspects of our own psyche, our own subconscious, right? It's where we point that finger inward and go, oh, I did the evil, but not in like a weird delusional way. Because sometimes a very important term that will help clarify a lot of other things is solipsism. Sometimes when we expand our awareness larger than maybe our groundedness can keep up with, our body can even keep up with, we'll go into solipsism. Because of that, I don't view it as being super negative the way that sometimes it's portrayed. It's portrayed very dark. And I think it has a horribly dark aspect to it, right? But you could take any truth. You could take literally anything and and make it logically dark, right? Like you could do that with a cup. Like anything, any truth or any like teaching, you can either use in a deceptive way, in a manipulative way, in a darker way. So solipsism really has only been understood through that, like it being bad. And instead, solipsism, the way that I see it through my own gnosis, is as being more neutral, and it has a tendency to be used in a manipulative way. So instead, solipsism is expansion. It is when you're questioning everything to the point where you go, well, what's real? Oh, is another country real? And I know that that's so bad to say, because you could go, oh my God, you're heartless, you're disconnected, you're a narcissist. But when you're expanding, you go through ebbs and flows. And some of those ebbs and flows are when you're questioning even if like you're like a reptile or not. You'll be like, am I the AI? So because of that, you're just open. You're very expansive. You're not sure about what reality is. Your upgrade is not stable yet, and that's fine. But as long as we have that awareness, it will help us make more sense of when we're going through that level of expansion, so that then we won't get trapped in it. We won't get stuck in it. We won't have it cut us off from completing that hallway of growth that we were in. And so, with all of these different like teachings, the first wave of ascension is very important because it goes through the most solipsism. So navigating it, you'd almost have to develop a high level of discernment. You'd have to develop mastery with solipsism when you're in the first wave of ascension, because what you're doing is being able to go inward and go, is all evil coming from within human? Are we the cause of it? Without getting stuck there. You'd have to also be able to alchemize the inner with the outer. And so you're dealing with everything at a much more vaporized level. You're dealing with everything at a much more subtle level. You're taking so much responsibility, and yet at the same time you're integrating so much. And so the first wave of ascension, how I received it through my gnosis, was one that is still active in the world. It's not like you just stop being active, but it's coming from a place where there's so much reflection, so much maturity and pause, because you're understanding that to continuously add actions with no foresight, you're causing more problems. So it's best to integrate and correct one's own consciousness and energy so that then their actions will be more powerful and aligned.
Your work speaks a lot to discernment, and I often find myself a bit of like the angel and the the person wrestling on top of Mount Pineal. The versus judgment. How do we discern between discernment and judgment? Because judgment has a very sticking sort of quality. When you judge one another, there's a lack of love, right? Whereas discernment, how do you discern between discernment and love? Can I ask that question? It's like discern, discern, judge. Yeah.
Yeah, so discernment always has something more objective when it's coming to its triggers, because there's this like myth, I guess you could call it, that you can't be triggered if you're coming from a higher state of consciousness. That's not true. That's like saying, like, if someone was being beat up in front of you, you wouldn't care. Like, discernment comes with triggers that have a lot of clarity. So they're not coming from our own distortions, our own shadow, our own denials. Those would be judgments. Those are when they're coming from our own, ego, our own complexes, things that are heavy and need to be purified. Discernment still comes with you feeling. It still comes with you having triggers, and it still comes with, information. It's just more clear. When we're in discernment versus judgment, we're looking at things from a far more unified unity consciousness perception, right? So like, we're looking at things from a very heart-centered way, where it just makes sense. So for instance, when we're looking at, like, even the way that some sort of legislation can sound like it's doing something beneficial, but it's also, we could see how distorted it is, and how, if that's implemented, that could be a vessel that unpacks things that we had no intention of allowing it to create or implement. The discernment is being able to understand the way that something could lead to evil in a very immediate way. Because if we want to get technical, everything can be like a Buddhist riddle, right? Where it's like, well, is that truly a negative experience? If it could go on forever. So it's a slippery slope. When it comes to discernment, it's not so much about being narrow-sighted so that we can't see a larger picture. Instead, it's something where we can explicitly identify something that is detrimental or negative, or something that can be harmful or dangerous. So with that, there's not a charge. You're just being able to clearly perceive. You're able to clearly perceive something, whether it's in like a larger way or whether it's in a more immediate way. there's something where with judgments are filled with roundabout. Judgments are always like this, like, well, they'll lead in a circle. They'll just lead in a circle because they're not based in anything. So with discernment, that's why I spent like 3 different videos teaching about morality or natural law. It's because if we don't know about natural law or what true morality is, we can't really gauge. We can't start building the foundation for discernment. We'll always just get kind of lost, either in a positive or a negative type of vibe. That's still judgment. It's still the realm of judgment. When we're looking at things from discernment now there, it's just coming, like, we still care about things, but it's just coming from a far more clear space. And so that's why, especially inside esoteric spiritual systems, they teach you about morality. So we don't know about that. So we think morality is intimately linked with our judgments, when in reality, our judgments have no effect on morality. We might call something moral, and that could be purely a projection of our own judgments, and the universe doesn't care. The universe isn't like, oh, okay, that's moral. Yeah. The universe isn't gaslit, but we could gaslight ourselves and others. So morality has to do with freedom. And that's why I was talking about legislation, but I didn't really clarify what I meant. But you could take this and apply it to anything, really, that has to do with freedom. But also, it's not just like freedom, right? Because so many things, the way that our reality is set up, are already based not where they were like completely aware and conscious. So what is freedom then? So because of that, discernment is being able to recognize what is pretending to be freedom but is really evil or dangerous, and what is true freedom. And so I get this really great question when I teach about morality. I think it's amazing, and I could probably just make a video on this question alone one day. And they say, yeah, well, we shouldn't invade someone's freedom because all things are free. And if we do, we violate natural law. If we were to go and impose ourselves on another person, right? Like, but what about if they did that to us? And that's why I'm like trying to make all of this sound less of a free for all and really bring it into like what it means exactly. Because we didn't start off in a reality where things didn't already happen. Things already happen. Things already set into motion. Judgments, things already set into motion, lack of freedom. So we're starting from there. We're starting in the middle of like a script or a story. And so because of that, natural law isn't looking at things from a very like juvenile lens. Discernment asks us, natural law asks us to implement itself where it makes sense. Okay, so like if something imposed itself on you, obviously you're not going to have a karmic backlash or repercussion for using discernment to defend yourself. Or sometimes things look like they're positive, like the powers that were like to infuse things in our reality that look like they're for freedom and they look like they're for things, and then they're not really. Discernment in that case would be the force of dharma, and dharma is linked to being able to tell in every situation what the good is. It's not saying start off from some arbitrary concept of good and then you have to be a victim of everything, because if you do it back, then you'll be punished by natural law. Instead, discernment is deeply linked with the concept of dharma. And dharma means that something could look absolutely awful in one context, and yet the most good, the highest good in another context. So discernment is linked with dharma. And it's being able to see where the true roots of freedom or the true roots of sovereignty is in a situation versus judgments. Once again, judgments aren't based in anything that has to do with a higher reality of freedom. Instead, it's really just based off of that person's own individual blocks, their denials, their programming, their beliefs, whatever makes up the composite of their mental landscape.
Do you have the time to explain stage 2 and stage 3 ascension, or are we out of time?
Oh no, we could, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Can you
I
describe stage 2, stage 3 ascension?
So, in the second wave of ascension, that's when people are really focused externally on the negative aspects, the darker aspects of reality. This is what I can best describe as when Neo from the Matrix is being unplugged, when he's in that chair and then he's got all of that metallic fluid going on him, and then he like wakes up into the real world and he's inside that like um that little decanter thing. But yeah, so that's the second wave of ascension. They're going through a rough time, so that's okay if they're not, integrating their emotions right then and there. That's all right. They're really becoming disillusioned, and they're understanding just how dangerous that, if anything, they're irked. They're irked because they were in a movie next to the killer the whole time and they had no clue. So when the second wave of ascension is inside, this stage of awakening, what's really happening is they're angry. They're angry and they're really overwhelmed, I would say. I wouldn't be surprised even if they're in the freeze response because of just how much overload they're experiencing. I even did an article on this called The Shock of Awakening. So it's almost like awakening from the shock of awakening. there's there's compact. It's like everything's so backed up that it's just a shock that they're not even fully aware they're still accumulating and they're still emanating, because it's not like in life it's not like one thing happens, right? It's like in that stage the band-aid doesn't come off fast. The band-aid comes off real slow and painful because so many different parts of that level of awakening are being introduced at once. So it's something that is very intense, and what I continue to say is overwhelming, because when you find out about one thread of reality, to even have it be what I would consider the second wave of ascension, it's not just going down one rabbit hole. It's getting into a gridlock of rabbit holes. You're in a gridlock of wormholes. You know those playpens where you just go down the tunnels and you're like at some point it's like that. It's you don't just go, "Oh wow, man, I found out about our soil." No, you find out about dark entities while you find out about the soil. And then you find out about the government. And then you find out about this and that. And so it's like this giant dimension, I would say,
You're in
of,
the trenches, big pharma, where the origins of money, all the stuff, all the stuff, all the stuff. Yeah, you're in the trenches.
yeah, it's just each layer just reveals a larger, thing, deception. So you're just like, you're gasping so much from shock that you just get silent. And so one of the strongest things, as I said, was like anger. You're really in a lot of energy that wants to be put out in the world, and that's actually what I would even say is a part of the process. I don't think that necessarily everyone needs to go into ascended master mode. I think that each stage helps the stage before it. And because of that, they have a lot more anger in the second wave of ascension, and they're a lot more in their active warrior state. And I find that actually really positive for that state.
Yeah, I find it really interesting because even David Hawkins's scale of energy, like that was a real. Looking at that, it's like the colors kind of go from quite dark and red, and then they start to flip into more lighter colors. But the flip literally happens at anger, and I think so many of us are disenfranchised from our anger. But it actually is a pathway into a higher place. But you've kind of got to work with it, learn it, dissolve it, transmute it, learn to actually understand it, befriend the beast in so many ways. And yet, anger is such a demonized emotion as well. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
And then stage. So I'm finding our way through the stages. Do we have one last stage to go through?
Oh, you mean the third stage of the
Yeah.
third? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot of, like, I would say, like, religious programming in the third wave of ascension that is kind of like, remember how I said things are in like a dynamism? We could also look at that like a washer and dryer. Like, why does a dryer dry clothes by going around a tumble? It's just because the heat of the motion. So I see everything as being purified through emotion. Now, when we're talking about like the third wave of ascension, they're still at choice points that could be sheerly potential. But they're in this motion, and this motion is like, if one's paying attention close enough, it's closing in on itself. It's trying to push it out into the second. But what that is it's this motion of like, I don't want to say snake eating its own tail, but basically it's being provided a lot of, like, you could think of it like instant karma, or you could look at it as like, the best way I could explain it was, there were these some documentaries when I first started waking up. It was just a permission slip because I always knew something was sus in this reality. So when I started getting documentary, I was like, yeah, I knew it. So, but then there were some documentaries, and I'm just glad that I'm claircognizant, and I knew, no, those are pretending to be awakening videos. And that's what I would describe the third wave of ascension. They're in this like bubble that seems like it could go deeper, or seems like it can go into higher levels of consciousness, but they're not. They're just kind of like rearranging chairs in a room, rearranging the furniture in a room, still not questioning the room or aware that they're in a room, but having almost like the diction and the terminal, like a setting that appears to be going deeper than it actually is, but it's just instantly going around itself. It's just going back into itself. And so I see it as a close. Well, I really see it kind of like a dark well, because what's really going on is the person themselves is not honest enough with whether to truly go through the awakening or not. But what happens is it can be seen as like closing in. The walls are closing in on them in this stage, where we can call it, in the fourth way tradition, there's this concept called false crystallization. False crystallization is when you harden too quickly into what you think is your higher self. Like how we went through the alchemical process and we talked about how coagulation, there is no better setting to talk about false crystallization than all of the work that we just went over. This was actually perfect, because no one will really be able to truly understand what false crystallization is until they know what the crystallization process is. And so this is perfect, because all that work that we covered this whole time is going through a process to help organize us, which is what heart mind coherence is. It's organizing us into unity. Now pretend that that process is going too quickly, and you become solid, but you're solid now in fundamentalism, or you're solid now in a false identity. That's what I meant by the walls closing in. That the third wave of ascension has almost like this time frame to either choose to truly go to the second wave of ascension, or truly choose to be honest with their awakening process, and then that will naturally go into the next step, or they will falsely crystallize into whatever they think is actually the awakening process. That's the challenge. Remember how I said earlier also about how there's archetypal themes in each process? The third wave of ascension has a very special and very unique challenge where the whole process can be done so prematurely that they don't actually go through the awakening process at all. But also on the other end of that spectrum, the gift of the third wave of ascension is that you're really in a germ form. You're really in this like potential form that is being exposed to deeper concepts and asked to discern them, even on an intuitive level, to go beyond what you might know as your own personal self into something where you just intuitively trust a larger process and then exit that stage or that milestone.
Wow. Sarah, for
So that's
those that
how I
want
see things.
to
You're like with the ink blot test, you're like, okay, so that's the reality.
Not at all. Not at all. For those that want to dive in deeper, I cannot recommend your YouTube channel highly enough. This was an insight into the types of topics that you cover. You go super deep. There's topics of conversation that still, were on my agenda to get to, and yet, you've been so generous with your time here today. We barely scratched the surface on Dharma. There's so many incredible topics of conversation left to be had, and they're all available on your YouTube channel. Your website is also coming together. You've got also like a newsletter which you send out to people. What's the best place for people to connect with you, Sarah?
Yeah, so people can connect with me the most through my website, thealchemist.community. There I have my social media channels, I have a newsletter prompt and my events. So yeah, and then if you want to dare, you can follow me on Instagram at the.alchemist, but you just beware, I have many imposter accounts.
We'll put a link to all the right accounts in the show notes below, and also your YouTube channel and your website. Sarah, Sister Bear, is right. My goodness, thank you for your time here today. Absolutely, and also, we didn't really get a chance to dive super deep into your backstory in terms of, the challenges you've gone through in life that have helped you sort of pop through into the different levels of awareness that you currently are embodying. And yeah, you've been on your own journey in its own right. And just want to take a moment to shout out you. Just thank you so much for you, at large, not just in today's conversation. Today's conversation stands on the shoulders of, the work you continue to show up for and put in and share with all of us. And as many will be able to tell through just today's podcast as well, I feel like when I'm following your channel, like I said, I've been following it for a few years and I feel like I'm growing. Yes, there's supportful information. We talked about how the map helps navigate the territory, but it genuinely feels like we're growing by your side as well. And that intimacy sort of really is very supportive in the way that it nurtures and fosters growth. So, yeah, thank you so much for you being you and doing you. Really appreciate you, Sister Beth.
I deeply appreciate that, and thank you for all your service. It really was the alchemy, okay? Because I've noticed that, like, it's the energy. Sometimes when I have a really strong transmission come through, it's also because of the person who's calling that forth from me. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That's very humbling to receive.
Trying to understand quantum laser modalities led me down scars. I went, wait,
Yeah.
you're right. Why do scars replicate? Because I was looking into scalar lasers and they were saying like this takes away that memory. I think scars replicate, but if you can heal the tension and trauma held within the skeleton system, the structure shifts, then the scar doesn't need what's supporting it. Nothing's supporting it. It doesn't need to be there anymore. So I actually think it comes down to structure.
Interesting. I would have drawn parallels to, Rupert Sheldrake, his morphic resonance stuff. Like, I would have thought that's the quantum sort of downloaded version of you sort of vibrating, and holds the memory of the scar. And so it's just like regenerating that because your memory is holding the scar in place. But if you could forget your scar, it just goes away. It's like,
right. So I've my whole life, ever since I've started becoming, like invested in awakening and consciousness, I have become fascinated with how much of this is purely mental. So I've been exploring how much of what can be purely, and even just as an energy healer, I want to know how to best help and stuff. And so I wouldn't be surprised if it has a very strong memory element to it. And I was even going to mention him. And then I went, no, that's a whole other things, so don't go down that. Thank you for asking such amazing questions.
Touchwood.
The question, sometimes is the strongest, part of the answer. It's the question.
Thank you. You're very kind. You, inspired soul, you made it through to the end of another incredible podcast. My goodness, how deep alchemy runs in this world and the relationship with duality. Sarah was phenomenal, touchwood, in the way she shared herself so abundantly in this podcast. Thank you so much for your inspirations to evolve by our sides, walking this conscious path. Now, I want to take a quick moment out to thank you if you have subscribed to the channel already. All of you that are subscribed to the channel, everything here is powered and empowered by your subscription to this channel. We recently hit 100,000 subscribers. It is such a blessing to have your loving guidance and support on this channel. To all of you that are yet to subscribe, please do take a moment. As I'm saying the word subscribe, the button below is lighting up in the colors of the Inspired Evolution. Please do take a moment, hit subscribe. It helps with everything we're doing around here, championing love, positivity, wisdom around the world. Now on screen, what you'll find is we did a conversation with William Whitecloud, also on the occult wisdom and personal development. His wisdom is incredibly profound as well. So if you'd love this conversation, you're totally going to love that one. Also on screen is another conversation with another very beautiful sister, Teal Swan. Incredible podcast in its own right as well, directing you there. Look, there's going to be some episodes on screen. Take your pick, make your click. I'll see you there. The key thing is stay inspired, keep evolving onwards, upwards, and inwards. See you in the next one.